The old man looked at me like he belonged there. Not startled, not confused, not dangerous exactly. Just waiting. The basement light was dead along with the rest of the house, and rain hammered the windows upstairs hard enough to shake the old beams. I stood frozen halfway down the stairs, clutching a flashlight in one hand, while muddy water dripped from the hem of my jeans. The old man sat in a wooden chair beside the breaker box, like he'd been sitting there for years. "You took your time getting back," he said. My son Tyler screamed behind me again. "Grandma, who is that?" I wish I could tell you I handled the moment calmly. At 62 years old, I'd survived raising 2 kids, burying my mother, caring for my father through cancer, and sitting through a divorce hearing that stripped away nearly every decent thing I had left. But standing in that basement, I was terrified. "Who the hell are you?" I asked. The old man slowly stood. He had to be close to 80, tall, thin, wearing an old green army jacket with a Detroit Tigers cap pulled low over white hair. He looked tired more than threatening. "My name's Elias Bennett," he said quietly. "And your father knew you'd come here someday." That stopped me cold. Nobody had mentioned my father in years, not after what happened. Not after he disappeared from town. A loud crack of thunder shook the house overhead. Tyler grabbed my arm. My daughter Megan stood at the top of the stairs holding her phone flashlight toward us, her face pale. "Mom," she whispered, "should I call somebody?" The old man shook his head slowly. "You can," he said, "but by the time the sheriff gets out here in this storm, I'll be gone." Then he looked directly at me. "But before I leave, you need to hear something about this house." That was 3 months after my divorce became final. 3 months after Gary walked away with almost everything we spent 40 years building together. People think losing a marriage hurts most because of heartbreak. At our age, it's not heartbreak that kills you. It's humiliation. Gary got the house in Columbus, the lake cabin in Florida, most of the retirement account, even our dog Murphy. You'd think a judge wouldn't separate a woman from a 12-year-old golden retriever she raised from a puppy, but apparently life keeps finding ways to surprise you. Gary had a younger lawyer, expensive suits, perfect hair, calm voice. I had a public defender and swollen eyes from crying in grocery store parking lots. By the end of the hearing, I felt less like a human being and more like leftover furniture nobody wanted. Megan tried helping me hold together what dignity I had left. "Mom," she told me one night while packing boxes, "you still have us." She meant well, but she was hurting too. At 38, she was going through her own divorce. She and Tyler had moved into a small apartment after her husband left for Arizona with another woman he met online. 3 generations of bad luck sitting around folding laundry together. That's how we ended up driving north to Michigan in my father's old Buick with everything we owned stuffed into the trunk. The lake house had belonged to my dad for decades. Nobody in the family wanted it after he died. Honestly, nobody even talked about it much. As kids, Megan and my son David spent summers there fishing off the dock and roasting hot dogs over a fire pit. Back then, the place felt magical. Now it looked like something forgotten by time. The mailbox leaned sideways. Half the shutters hung crooked. The porch steps sagged under our feet when we carried in boxes. Tyler looked around and muttered, "This place looks haunted." "Don't start," Megan told him. But secretly I agreed with him. Inside smelled like mildew old wood and closed-up winters. Still, it was ours. Or at least the bank hadn't taken it yet. That first evening we unpacked canned food, blankets, and a coffee maker. Rain started around sunset. By 9 o'clock the storm had turned violent. Wind screamed through the trees surrounding the lake. The power died with a loud pop. Tyler groaned, "Perfect." Megan lit candles while I searched kitchen drawers for a flashlight. I remember thinking how strange silence feels after electricity disappears. No refrigerator hum, no television noise, just rain and darkness. Then came the knocking. 3 slow knocks at the front door. Everyone froze. Tyler whispered, "Did you hear that?" Of course we heard it. Another 3 knocks echoed through the house. I opened the door expecting maybe a neighbor. Nobody stood there. Only rain. But lying on the porch was a white envelope with my name written across the front. Linda Carter. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Cash offer for property. No signature, no phone number. Just a dollar amount large enough to make my knees weak. Megan stared at it. "Mom, who would offer this kind of money for this dump?" I didn't answer. Because deep down something about it scared me. An hour later, the power still hadn't returned, so I grabbed the flashlight and headed for the basement breaker. And that's when I found Elias waiting in the dark. He glanced at the envelope still clutched in my hand. "They started faster than I expected," he murmured. "What are you talking about?" I snapped. Elias walked slowly toward the stairs. Your father spent 30 years making sure certain people never got what they wanted. He looked around the basement carefully. Now they think you're weak enough to sell. I don't even know who you are. No, he said softly, but Walter trusted me. Nobody had called my father Walter around me in decades. To me, he was simply Dad. The man who vanished from our lives little by little after my mother died. The man people in town whispered about. The man Gary once called that crazy old hermit. Elias pointed toward the far basement wall. Before your father died, he said he told me someday you'd come back here after losing everything. A chill crept through me that had nothing to do with the storm. He said when that day came, you'd finally understand why he stayed. I stared at him. Outside, thunder rolled over the lake. Then Elias said the words that changed my life forever. Your father didn't leave you this house, he said quietly. He left you the truth. Rain hammered the roof hard enough to keep any of us from sleeping after Elias left. I stood by the living room window most of the night watching the dark shoreline disappear behind sheets of rain while Megan and Tyler slept under borrowed blankets beside the fireplace. Every few minutes I replayed the old man's words in my head. Your father didn't leave you this house. He left you the truth. At my age you learn to distrust dramatic statements. Usually when somebody says something mysterious it turns out to be nonsense or salesmanship. Still something about Elias felt real. Not because he frightened me. Because he looked sad. People who lie for profit usually carry a certain energy. Confidence. Sharpness. They want something from you. Elias looked like a man carrying something heavy for too long. Around 3 in the morning, the storm finally weakened enough for me to doze off in Dad's old recliner. I woke to the smell of coffee. Megan stood in the kitchen wearing one of my father's flannel shirts over sweatpants. Well, she said, forcing a smile, the stove still works. Morning light revealed just how rough the lake house really was. Water stains covered the ceiling. One kitchen cabinet hung crooked from rusted hinges. The wallpaper peeled near the windows, and the hardwood floors tilted slightly toward the lake side of the house. Tyler shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. So, he said carefully, are we going to talk about basement, Grandpa? I almost laughed despite myself. Not before coffee, I said. But the truth was I didn't know what to say. Because once daylight arrived, the whole thing sounded impossible. An old man waiting in a basement during a storm. It sounded like the beginning of one of those ridiculous late-night cable mysteries. Still, the envelope remained on the kitchen table. Real. So was the fear I felt when Elias mentioned my father. After breakfast, I drove into town hoping normal errands might settle my nerves. The town of Blackwater looked smaller than I remembered. Most lake towns up north do after enough years pass. The hardware store still stood on Main Street beside the diner where my mother used to order grilled cheese sandwiches during summer fishing trips. Only now half the storefront sat empty. I stopped at Miller's Hardware for batteries and cleaning supplies. The young cashier couldn't have been older than 25, but the older man stocking shelves behind him stared at me for a long moment. Then his expression changed. You're Walter Carter's daughter, he said. Not a question. I nodded cautiously. Haven't seen one of your family around here in years. His tone wasn't unfriendly exactly. Just careful. My dad passed away 8 years ago, I said. The old man slowly leaned against the shelf. Walter was a good man. Something in the way he said it caught my attention. Not everybody used to say that. Growing up, my father had always felt like two different people depending on who you asked. To me, he was quiet, patient, the kind of dad who fixed broken bicycles and made pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse when Megan and David visited. But in town, people whispered. After Mom died, Dad became more isolated every year. He stopped attending church, stopped coming to town events. Some people claimed he drank too much, others said he'd gotten paranoid. Gary used to hate visiting him. He acts like somebody's after him, Gary once complained during a Thanksgiving trip years earlier. At the time I thought Dad was simply lonely. Now I wasn't so sure. When I carried my supplies outside, I noticed a black pickup truck parked across the street. The driver sat behind tinted windows, watching me. The moment I looked directly at the truck, it pulled away. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. Back at the lake house, I found Tyler wandering around the basement with a flashlight. You shouldn't be down here alone, I told him. Relax, Grandma. He pointed toward the breaker box. I was trying to figure out how that old guy even got in. Truthfully, I'd wondered the same thing. The basement had only one small window and the stair entrance from the kitchen. No sign of forced entry. No footprints. Nothing. Tyler shined the flashlight across the far wall. You notice this? At first I didn't understand what he meant. Then I saw it. One section of the basement floor near the back wall looked slightly different from the rest. The concrete color changed subtly there, like part of it had been repaired years earlier. Tyler crouched beside it. You think there's something under there? Probably old pipes, I said automatically. But my stomach tightened. Because my father had worked construction most of his life. And suddenly I remembered something. When I was maybe 12 years old, I came downstairs one summer while Dad was working in the basement late at night. He nearly jumped out of his skin when he saw me. I'd never forgotten the fear on his face. Linda, he snapped louder than usual, don't come down here without telling me first. At the time I cried because I thought he was angry. Now I wondered what he'd been hiding. That afternoon, Megan and I started cleaning old furniture while Tyler explored the property outside. Around 4 o'clock, another vehicle pulled into the gravel driveway. This time it was a silver Lexus. A man stepped out wearing an expensive navy coat and polished shoes completely unsuited for mud. He smiled before I even reached the porch. Mrs. Carter, he said warmly, Richard Holloway. The name meant nothing to me. I apologize for arriving unannounced, he continued smoothly. I represent a development group interested in several lakefront properties. Of course. The envelope. You're offering to buy this place. Richard glanced toward the lake with a practiced smile. This property has tremendous potential. You mean expensive potential? He chuckled softly like we shared a joke. I understand you've recently gone through difficult circumstances. His eyes drifted toward the aging house. I'd hate for you to feel trapped maintaining a property this size. There it was. Not concern. Pressure. I crossed my arms. My father owned this house for 40 years. Funny nobody cared until now. Something flickered behind Richard's smile, then disappeared. Your father was an interesting man. The same careful tone from the hardware store. Before I could respond, another truck pulled into the driveway. Old rusted loud muffler. Elias climbed out slowly. The moment Richard Holloway saw him, his entire expression hardened. For one brief second, the politeness vanished completely. Elias walked up beside me without looking at Richard. Don't sell the house, he said quietly. Richard forced another smile. I'm simply making a generous business offer. No, Elias replied calmly. You're trying to bury something. Silence settled over the yard. Wind stirred across the lake behind us. Then Richard looked directly at me. Mrs. Carter, he said softly. You should ask yourself why an old man would risk dragging your family into things that ended decades ago. Elias finally turned toward him. Because some graves don't stay buried forever. Richard stared at him for several seconds. Then he got back into his Lexus and drove away without another word. I looked at Elias. What the hell is going on? He removed his cap slowly. And for the first time I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Your father kept records, he said. Records powerful people would kill to find. I didn't sleep much after Elias told me about the records. At 62 years old, sleep doesn't come easy even under normal circumstances. At a collapsing marriage, a decaying lake house, and the possibility that wealthy strangers are circling your property for hidden evidence, and your mind starts running like an old washing machine that won't shut off. The next morning I woke before sunrise and found Elias sitting on the porch with a thermos of coffee balanced beside him. The lake was perfectly still. No storm, no wind. Just gray water stretching beneath a pale Michigan sky. You always sneak onto people's property before breakfast, I asked. Elias smiled faintly. Your father used to say mornings were the only honest part of the day. I sat beside him without answering. For a while, we just listened to birds moving through the pine trees. Finally, I said, start talking. Elias nodded slowly like he'd expected that. In the 70s, he began this town changed fast. Money came in. Developers bought shoreline property cheap. New marinas, resorts, vacation homes. He stared toward the water. Most folks thought it was progress. And my father, he worked construction for Holloway's father back then. That surprised me. Dad rarely talked about work, except ordinary stories about roofing jobs or concrete pouring. He discovered something by accident, Elias continued. Chemical dumping. I frowned. What kind of dumping? Industrial waste. Drums buried near the north side of the lake. Elias rubbed his hands together slowly. A few years later, people started getting sick. The calmness in his voice somehow made the story worse. I remembered rumors from childhood. Neighbors with strange illnesses. One family that moved away suddenly after their youngest daughter got leukemia. At the time, adults never explained much around children. They covered it up, I asked. Elias looked at me carefully. Your father tried stopping them. The old porch boards creaked beneath us. I shook my head slowly. That doesn't make sense. My father barely talked to anybody by the time I was grown. Because they destroyed him first. That sentence hit harder than I expected. For years I carried quiet resentment toward my father. Not hatred exactly, but disappointment. After Mom died, he disappeared emotionally long before he disappeared physically. Birthdays forgotten, calls unanswered. Entire summers without visits. Gary used to say your dad likes misery too much. Part of me believed him. Now I wondered how wrong we'd all been. Elias reached into his coat pocket and handed me an old photograph. 5 men stood beside a construction truck sometime in the late 70s. One of them was my father. Younger, stronger, smiling. I almost didn't recognize him. That's Richard Holloway's father beside Walter, Elias said quietly. The man standing next to Dad wore the same polished confidence I'd seen in Richard yesterday. Something cold settled in my stomach. What exactly did my father keep? Proof. Proof of what? That people in this town sold their souls for money. Before I could ask more, Tyler burst through the screen door holding a rusted metal box. Grandma, he said breathlessly, I found this under the stairs. Elias stood so fast his coffee nearly spilled. Where? In the basement. The box looked old, military green, rusted around the edges. My hands trembled slightly when I opened it. Inside sat dozens of papers wrapped carefully in yellowed plastic. Receipts, photographs, bank statements, and names. So many names. I pulled out one document showing a payment ledger from 1978. Several town officials appeared beside dollar amounts. Police chief, county inspector, even a doctor. At the bottom sat one name I recognized instantly. Frank Dawson. My Uncle Frank, Mom's younger brother. I stared at the page in disbelief. No, I whispered. Elias lowered his eyes. He testified against your father. I looked up sharply. For what? Walter accused Holloway's company publicly, claimed they poisoned the lake. Elias sighed deeply. But when hearings started, witnesses suddenly changed their stories, including my uncle. I sat there stunned while decades of family memories rearranged themselves inside my head. Uncle Frank always hated Dad. At holidays he'd mutter things like Walter's chasing ghosts again, or your father's gonna ruin himself with all this nonsense. I thought they simply disliked each other. Now I understood. Frank sold him out. Tyler picked up one of the photographs. What's this? The picture showed several rusted barrels half buried near muddy shoreline. Warning labels barely visible. Even I could tell the image was bad news. Megan appeared in the doorway behind us. What's going on? Nobody answered immediately. Because suddenly the quiet lake house didn't feel abandoned anymore. It felt watched. That evening I drove into town alone to confront Uncle Frank. He lived in a retirement community about 15 minutes south near Traverse City. Small apartment, Golf Channel always playing, recliner facing the television. When he opened the door and saw me, his smile disappeared immediately. Well, he muttered, didn't expect company. I walked inside holding the ledger in my purse. You lied about my father. Frank shut the door slowly. For a moment he looked very old. Elias Bennett found you, he said. Not a question. You took money. Frank lowered himself carefully into his recliner. You don't understand how things were back then. Then explain it. His jaw tightened. People needed jobs, Linda. Holloway kept this town alive. And poisoning people was acceptable. You think your father was some hero, Frank snapped suddenly. Walter scared everybody. He kept pushing and pushing. Because he was right. Frank looked away. That silence told me everything. After nearly a minute he spoke softly. You know what happens to men who fight people with money? They lose. I felt anger rise inside me, slow and hot. My father lost his family too. Frank flinched slightly at that. For the first time guilt crossed his face. You weren't there after your mother died, he murmured. Walter stopped trusting anybody. He thought everyone was watching him. Were they? Frank didn't answer. When I left his apartment, dusk had settled across town. And sitting across the street was the same black pickup truck from yesterday. Engine running. Waiting. This time when I drove away, the truck followed me. Not aggressively. Just far enough behind to make sure I noticed. By the time I reached the lake house, my hands shook on the steering wheel. I rushed inside and locked the door. Megan saw my face immediately. Mom, what happened? Before I could answer, Tyler yelled from the hallway. There's somebody outside. We all turned toward the lake-facing window. A figure stood near the dock in the darkness, watching the house. Then slowly the person lifted something into the air. A gas can. A terrible realization hit me all at once. They weren't trying to scare us anymore. They were trying to erase everything my father left behind. The man by the dock stood perfectly still while rainwater dripped from the gas can hanging at his side. Tyler whispered, Grandma. Megan grabbed his shoulder and pulled him back from the window. Every instinct inside me screamed to call the police. But another part of me already understood something ugly about small towns and powerful families. Sometimes the police arrive too late. Sometimes they arrive already knowing who they're supposed to protect. The figure near the dock slowly turned and disappeared into the darkness before I could reach the front porch. I stepped outside anyway. Cold wind swept across the lake hard enough to sting my face. The dock creaked softly in the dark, empty now except for puddles reflecting moonlight through broken clouds. No footprints. No vehicle headlights. Nothing. Still the smell of gasoline lingered faintly in the air. That was enough. Inside, Megan crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "We need to leave." "Nobody's leaving," Tyler said immediately. "Tyler." "No," he snapped. "Mom, somebody tried to scare us off. That means Grandma's father was telling the truth." I looked at him in surprise. 3 months earlier, Tyler barely spoke to anyone unless forced. After his parents' divorce, he spent most days hidden behind headphones and video games, carrying anger around like extra weight on his shoulders. Now I saw something different in him. Purpose. Megan looked exhausted. "I'm serious, Mom. This is insane. We can't fight rich people in some mystery movie." "She's right," I admitted quietly. The room went silent. Then I looked toward the basement door. "But I also can't walk away without knowing what my father died protecting." That changed something inside me. For the first time since my divorce, I stopped feeling like a victim being pushed from one disaster into another. Fear remained. But underneath it, something older woke up. Stubbornness. The next morning, Elias returned, carrying a brown paper bag full of groceries. "Figured you folks could use real food," he said. Inside were eggs, bacon bread, and black coffee from the diner in town. Tyler grinned immediately. "Okay," he said, "I officially trust basement grandpa now." Elias actually laughed at that. It softened him somehow. Over breakfast, I told him about the man by the dock. His face darkened immediately. "They're getting nervous." "Who exactly is they?" Megan asked sharply. Elias sat quietly for a moment before answering. "Richard Holloway owns half this county now. Marina's construction company's Shoreline Developments." He looked at me, but his father started with almost nothing. "The dumping." Elias nodded. "When Walter discovered it, Holloway's father thought he could buy him off like everybody else." He paused. "Problem was your father couldn't be bought." I stared down at my coffee. Nobody had described my father that way before. Not honorable, not brave, usually just difficult. "You said my father kept records," I said. "Why not turn them over years ago?" He tried. And Elias gave me a tired smile. "Money wins a lot in America, Linda, especially in the 70s. That truth landed hard because it still felt true now. After breakfast, Tyler insisted on searching the basement again. This time Elias joined him while Megan and I cleaned upstairs. Around noon, I heard Tyler yell, "Grandma, get down here." I nearly slipped running to the basement. Tyler stood beside the staircase, pointing toward the wall underneath it. "There," he said breathlessly. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then Elias pressed against a wooden panel hidden beneath decades of dust. It moved inward slightly. A hidden door. My pulse started hammering. Together, Elias and Tyler pulled the panel open, revealing a narrow crawl space behind the stairs. The air inside smelled stale and damp. Elias aimed a flashlight into the darkness. "Oh my God," Megan whispered behind me. Shelves lined the hidden room wall to wall. Boxes. File folders. Tape recordings, newspaper clippings. Decades of secrets. I stepped inside, slowly brushing cobwebs from my coat sleeve. Everything had been organized carefully, methodically, like my father spent years preparing for this moment. Tyler opened one box filled with cassette tapes labeled by date. Megan uncovered folders containing medical reports and environmental studies. Then I found the letters. Dozens of them. Some addressed to lawyers, others to state agencies, newspaper editors, even senators. Most were never mailed. At the bottom of one box sat an old cassette recorder. Elias picked it up carefully. "Walter made recordings," he said quietly. I pressed play before anybody could stop me. Static crackled through the tiny speaker. Then my father's voice filled the room. Older, tired, but unmistakably his. "If something happens to me," he said, "people need to know Holloway paid them all." Megan covered her mouth. I couldn't breathe. Hearing a dead parent's voice does something strange to the human heart. For a moment, time folds in on itself. You become a child again instantly. Dad continued speaking on the tape. "Frank took money, Sheriff Dunleavy too. Dr. Mercer signed false reports. Papers rustled somewhere near the recorder. They buried everything." Then came a long silence. Finally, Dad spoke again, softer this time. "Linda deserved better than the life this caused." Tears hit my cheeks before I realized I was crying, because suddenly I understood something that shattered me completely. My father hadn't abandoned us emotionally after Mom died. He'd been terrified enough to spend years hiding evidence inside his own home. Megan wrapped her arms around me while the tape hissed softly in the silence. Then Tyler said, "Somebody's outside." We all froze. A vehicle engine rumbled from the driveway above us. Elias immediately killed the flashlight. The basement fell dark. Footsteps crossed the porch overhead. Slow, heavy. Then came the sound of someone trying the front door handle. Once. Twice. Tyler whispered, "They know." Nobody moved. The doorknob rattled harder this time. Then suddenly stopped. A long silence followed. Finally we heard the vehicle drive away. Only after several minutes did Elias speak. "They're searching for the records now." I wiped my eyes quickly. "How bad is this really?" Elias looked directly at me. "Bad enough that your father lost his entire life protecting this evidence." He hesitated. "And bad enough that Holloway will destroy anyone standing in his way." That evening, after locking every door and window, I sat alone on the porch listening to waves hit the dock. For the first time in years I thought about Gary. Not with sadness. Not even anger. Perspective changes strange things. A few months earlier I believed my husband taking the house was the worst betrayal imaginable. Now I was learning betrayal had shaped my family long before Gary ever entered my life. Then headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. A familiar silver Lexus rolled slowly toward the house. Richard Holloway stepped out wearing the same calm smile as before. But this time he wasn't pretending to be friendly. "You found something," he said. Richard Holloway stood in my driveway with his hands tucked calmly inside his coat pockets while lake wind moved through the pine trees behind him. "You found something," he repeated. The porch light above me flickered weakly after the storm damage, throwing shadows across his face. I stayed near the front door. At my age, I said carefully, "I've learned not to answer questions from strangers at night." Richard smiled faintly. "Your father always said things like that too." Hearing him speak about my father made my skin crawl. "What do you want?" "To help you avoid making a serious mistake." That almost made me laugh. 3 months earlier, I would have folded under pressure like this. Back then, I still believed politeness protected people. Divorce cured me of that illusion. Now I understood something important about wealthy men. The dangerous ones rarely shout. They speak softly while taking everything from you. Richard stepped closer to the porch. "I know Elias showed you something," he said, "and I know Walter left records behind." I crossed my arms tightly. "And if he did?" Richard's expression stayed calm, but his eyes hardened. "Your father wasted his life chasing ghosts." "No," I said quietly. "I think other people wasted it for him." For the first time, Richard lost patience. "Mrs. Carter, you have no idea how much damage those accusations caused." "Then why are you so afraid of old papers?" Silence settled between us. Wind rattled dead leaves across the driveway. Finally, Richard sighed. "You think this ends with justice?" he asked softly. "It won't. It ends with lawyers, investigators, and your family dragged through years of ugliness." He looked toward the house windows where Tyler and Megan stood watching. "Your grandson deserves better than that." There it was. Not a threat exactly. Something colder. A warning. I stared at him for several seconds. Then I said the one thing I never imagined myself saying at this stage of life. "You should leave my property." Richard studied me carefully like he was recalculating something. Then he nodded once. "When people lose everything," he said quietly, "they often confuse anger with courage." After he drove away, I locked every door in the house. Tyler looked furious. "I hate that guy." "Get in line," Megan muttered. But Elias looked more worried than angry. "He's desperate now," he said. "Good," Tyler snapped. "No," Elias replied sharply. "Desperate men are dangerous." That night, nobody slept much. Around 2 in the morning, I heard Elias moving around downstairs. I found him sitting alone at the kitchen table drinking coffee in darkness except for the stove light. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded without conviction. "I keep thinking about your father." I sat across from him quietly. "He knew this day might come," Elias said. "That's why he organized everything so carefully." I looked toward the basement door. "All those years," I whispered. "And nobody believed him." Elias rubbed tired eyes. "Some did." That surprised me. "Then why didn't anybody help?" A bitter smile crossed his face. "Fear pays better than honesty most days." I thought about that long after he went to bed. Fear had shaped almost every major moment of my life lately. Fear of losing my marriage. Fear of losing stability. Fear of aging alone. Fear of not mattering anymore. But somewhere between the divorce and this old lake house, something strange had happened. I stopped being afraid of losing things. Because the worst had already happened. And somehow I survived it. The next morning I made a decision. "We're not hiding anymore," I told Megan. She looked up from the kitchen sink. "What does that mean?" "It means if Holloway wants silence, we do the opposite." 2 hours later, Elias drove me into Traverse City to meet an old newspaper editor named Helen Morris. Helen had to be close to 75 with silver hair, reading glasses hanging from a chain, and the sharpest eyes I'd ever seen. When Elias explained why we were there, she locked her office door immediately. "Let me see the documents." For nearly 3 hours, Helen reviewed ledgers, photographs, and copies of environmental reports while saying almost nothing. Finally, she leaned back in her chair slowly. "My God," she murmured. "You believe it?" I asked. Helen looked offended. "I covered this story in 1979 before my editor killed it." She tapped one photograph angrily. "People got sick here, Linda." A heavy silence filled the office. Then Helen looked directly at me. "You understand what happens once this moves publicly?" I nodded. "I think so." "No," she said softly. "You really don't." But she agreed to help anyway. That afternoon marked the beginning of Richard Holloway's collapse. At first it happened quietly. Helen contacted 2 investigative reporters she trusted in Detroit. Copies of the records went to environmental attorneys. One former state investigator agreed to review the evidence unofficially. Nobody announced anything publicly yet. But rumors started spreading, and rumors travel fast in small towns. 3 days later, somebody slashed all 4 tires on Elias's truck. The day after that, Tyler found dead fish scattered across the dock. Then came Gary. I should have known he'd appear eventually. He arrived wearing an expensive wool coat and the same irritated expression he always used when inconvenienced. "Jesus, Linda," he muttered while stepping inside the house. "This place is falling apart." I stared at him for a moment. Funny how quickly love can become unfamiliar. 40 years together and suddenly he looked like a stranger renting my memories. "What do you want, Gary?" He sighed dramatically. "I heard some crazy rumors in Columbus." His eyes shifted toward Elias sitting by the fireplace. "You're mixed up in something ugly." I almost laughed. "You mean uglier than leaving your wife broke at 62? Gary ignored that. "There are investors involved here, important people." He lowered his voice. "You need to sell this property before things get worse." "There it is," Megan said from the kitchen doorway. "Finally." Gary frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means stop pretending you care about Mom." His jaw tightened immediately. For years, Megan avoided confronting him directly. Now she looked at him with open disgust. Gary turned back toward me. "Linda, I'm serious. Holloway's offering good money." That stopped me cold. "How do you know Richard Holloway?" Gary hesitated half a second too long. And that was enough. Everything suddenly clicked together. The pressure. The sudden interest in the property. The timing. "You're involved with him." Gary's face hardened. "Business partners cross paths." "Business partners," Megan repeated bitterly. I stared at the man I spent most of my adult life trusting. Then I realized something painful. Gary didn't come here because he felt guilty. He came because he was scared. The records threatened him too. "You knew?" I whispered. Gary looked away. Not denial. Not anger. Just shame. And somehow that felt worse. After a long silence, Elias finally spoke from across the room. "Walter warned me this would happen." Gary frowned. "What?" Elias met his eyes steadily. "He said someday the people closest to Linda would betray her before strangers ever did." Nobody spoke after that. Gary left 20 minutes later without saying goodbye. That evening, local news stations started calling the house. By morning, Richard Holloway's company stock had begun falling. And just before sunset, Tyler came running down from the road holding his phone. "Grandma," he said breathlessly, "you need to see this." On the screen was a photograph. Elias, lying unconscious beside his truck in a hospital parking lot. Covered in blood. I got to the hospital just after midnight. The emergency entrance smelled like disinfectant, burnt coffee, and exhaustion. Rainwater dripped from my coat onto the tile floor while Megan stayed behind at the lake house with Tyler. At our age, hospitals stop feeling temporary. They start feeling familiar. Too familiar. Elias lay in a small room on the second floor with bruises covering half his face and stitches above one eye. Machines beeped softly beside him while snow drifted past the dark windows outside. For one terrible second, seeing him there reminded me of my father during his final months. Fragile, worn down, alone. Elias opened his eyes when I entered. "Took you long enough," he muttered weakly. I almost cried from relief. "What happened?" He tried sitting up and winced immediately. "Parking garage," he murmured. "2 men. Holloway." Elias didn't answer directly. But he didn't need to. I sat beside the bed quietly. "You should walk away while you still can," he said after a moment. "No, Linda. I spent 40 years letting men make decisions for me. My voice surprised even me. I'm done with that." Elias stared at me for several seconds. Then slowly he smiled. Walter would have liked hearing that. Those words hit me harder than they should have. Because all my life I believed my father saw me as weak. Too soft, too trusting, too emotional. Now I wondered if he simply hoped I'd someday become stronger than he was. Elias motioned toward the bedside drawer. There's something inside for you. I opened it carefully. Inside sat an old folded map sealed in plastic. Fishing routes marked across Blackwater Lake. At first it looked ordinary. Then I noticed small symbols drawn in red ink near the northern shoreline. What is this? Elias lowered his voice. The last evidence Walter hid. A chill moved through me. You knew where it was this whole time? No. He coughed painfully. Walter only told me enough to guide you if things got bad. And now, they're bad. I unfolded the map fully across my lap. One section contained coordinates circled twice beside a handwritten note in my father's unmistakable block lettering. When the water is still. He hid something in the lake. Elias nodded weakly. Walter never trusted the house completely. Said someday people would tear it apart looking for proof. He closed his eyes briefly, so he made sure the most important evidence stayed somewhere nobody would think to search. I looked back down at the map. The lake. All these years, secrets sitting beneath the same water where my children once learned to fish. You need to go before sunrise, Elias whispered, before Holloway realizes what Walter did. Back at the lake house, Megan looked horrified when I explained the map. You are not going out onto that lake in December. We don't have a choice. There's always a choice. Tyler stepped closer immediately. I'm going with Grandma. No, Megan snapped. Yes. I watched them argue while something strange settled inside me. Family. Messy, loud, protective. For months after the divorce, I thought Gary destroying our marriage meant our family had collapsed completely. But standing there in that old kitchen, I realized something important. Families survive differently than marriages do. By 4:30 the next morning, Tyler and I pushed my father's old aluminum fishing boat into freezing black water beneath a sky still heavy with clouds. The motor sputtered twice before catching. You okay? Tyler asked. I smiled tightly. Ask me when we're back on shore. Truthfully, I was terrified. The lake stretched around us dark and endless while icy wind cut through my gloves. Tyler held the flashlight over the map while I guided the boat toward the northern side. Everything felt silent except the motor and waves hitting aluminum. Finally, Tyler pointed ahead. There, a weathered red buoy floated near a rocky section of shoreline almost hidden by trees. My father's marker. We killed the motor and drifted closer. Tyler leaned over with a hooked pole while I held the flashlight steady. For several minutes we found nothing. Then the hook caught. Something's down there. Together we pulled slowly until a rusted metal lockbox emerged dripping from black water. My hands shook opening it. Inside sat sealed documents wrapped carefully in waterproof plastic. Photographs. Signed statements. Original contracts. And one cassette tape labeled simply, "If they finally come for the truth." Tyler looked at me wide-eyed. This is it, isn't it? I nodded slowly. This was the thing my father sacrificed everything to protect. The thing powerful men spent decades trying to erase. By noon that day, federal investigators arrived in Blackwater. Helen Morris moved fast once she saw the lake evidence. Environmental agencies reopened the original contamination case within hours. Reporters flooded the town by evening. And Richard Holloway's empire began collapsing almost immediately. Former employees started talking. Retired officials panicked. Bank records surfaced. By the following week, state investigators seized documents from Holloway development offices across 3 counties. The story exploded nationally after the cassette recording of my father reached the press. Suddenly, Walter Carter wasn't the paranoid old hermit people mocked for decades. He was the whistleblower nobody listened to. One afternoon I watched television coverage showing Richard Holloway being escorted into a courthouse surrounded by cameras. For a moment I expected satisfaction, victory, maybe even joy. Instead, I mostly felt tired. Because revenge turns out stranger than people imagine. You spend years dreaming about justice, but when it finally arrives, it doesn't give back what was stolen. It doesn't return marriages, or lost time, or lonely nights wondering why your life fell apart. A week later, Gary came to the lake house alone. No expensive coat this time, no confidence either. He stood awkwardly on the porch while snow drifted across the lake behind him. I heard they froze my accounts, he said quietly. I folded my arms, and Gary swallowed hard. I didn't know how deep Holloway was involved back then. But you still worked with him. He looked down. I thought selling the land would solve everything. That sentence told me all I needed to know about Gary. All his life he believed money solved pain, protected dignity, created worth. And now he stood broke emotionally in ways no court could repair. I was cruel to you, he admitted softly. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then unexpectedly I stopped feeling angry. Not because Gary deserved forgiveness. Because carrying hatred suddenly felt exhausting. I loved you for most of my life, I said quietly. That doesn't disappear just because you failed me. Tears filled his eyes immediately. At our age, people cry differently. Less dramatic. More tired. Gary nodded once before leaving. I never saw him again after that day. Spring arrived slowly in Blackwater. The town started cleaning the shoreline using settlement money from the investigation. Families who suffered illnesses decades earlier finally received public acknowledgement. And one evening near sunset, I sat beside Elias on the repaired dock while Tyler laughed nearby, skipping stones across the water. You know, Elias murmured, Walter used to sit right here saying this lake would outlive all our secrets. I smiled softly. He was right. Elias handed me one final envelope. Walter's handwriting covered the front. For Linda. Inside was a short letter from my father. Not about evidence, not about revenge. About kindness. About surviving disappointment without becoming bitter. About how losing everything sometimes clears enough space to finally see what matters. I cried reading it. Not from grief anymore. From peace. So, if you're listening to my story tonight carrying betrayal of your own, maybe this is what I'd tell you. Sometimes, the people who break your heart also push you toward the life you were supposed to find all along. And sometimes, long after the storm passes, you discover you were never as alone as you feared. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who may need the reminder that it's never too late for truth healing or a second beginning.